Can a pixel art roguelike inspire gamers to forever hunt for fortune and power? Or is the challenge too much and gamers tap out? Let's find out as we evaluate Vagante. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I am BD and this is Did Anyone Play, a series where we investigate, analyze, and determine the truth about how much gamers have actually played a game like Vagante. How do we do this? We use trophies and achievement milestones within games and then compare those results to a growing database to evaluate and rank games compared to the rest of the industry. Using objective data and statistical comparisons, we can draw conclusions. We aren't reviewing the game in the traditional sense. Our goal is to provide analysis that can be better used to understand player preference. Please drop a like or a sub to the channel if you want more of these types of videos. We're just starting out, so anything you can do is very much appreciated. And a quick spoiler warning is we may be talking about some elements of late game progression. A special shout out to Droopy Puma for suggesting this game. Don't forget to leave your own suggestions in the comments down below. And I do apologize for how late this next video has been. Holidays, bad weather, and a very sick dog that needed a lot of attention held me back. So let's find out if anyone actually played Vagante on Steam, PlayStation, and Xbox. Remember that all percentages we will be talking about here come from the total number of players that played the game, not bought the game. So these results are a full reflection on how players played, consumed, and quit Vagante. The first milestone that players are most likely to hit is called Fresh Air. This milestone is achieved when players complete the Caves. The Caves is the very first area the player must conquer and has a few varied bosses that can be fought within it. On PlayStation, we see that 64.7% of players made it through the Caves. On Steam, it was 48%, and for Xbox, 50.1%. This isn't the strongest start. Here you can see how this stacks up to the database average. One thing to keep in mind is that a player has to really learn the game and fight through a lot of battles to hit this first milestone. So while it doesn't look great there, because this is a challenging roguelike, it might be acceptable depending on the future milestones. But playing devil's advocate, half of the players on Steam and Xbox never completed the first area. PlayStation is a little better, but you do have quite a few players that left before experiencing much of Vagante. So what is Vagante? Maybe we need to understand this a bit better to make more sense of the data. Vagante is an indie roguelike adventure. It's set in a dark fantasy, and a player can pick from a number of classes, 3 to start out and more unlock after that. Vagante can be played solo or with friends and features permanent death and procedurally generated levels. It was developed and published by Nuke9, and this is their first released game. Vagante was released on Steam in February of 2018, and then released on PlayStation and Xbox 4 years later, in January of 2022. The second milestone players would likely reach in Vagante is called Darkness Beckons. This is achieved when players complete the forest area. So for Xbox, we have 28% of players reaching this milestone, while on PlayStation we see 37.1% make it, and for Steam it's 31.9%. That's another big drop, not quite as large as the first one, but also not leveling off like we would like to see. It's always good to understand the competition a game was up against when it launched. We'll take a look at the console since they launched 4 years after Steam. What was happening around January 27th of 2022? Well, comparative titles like Spelunky 2, Windjammers 2, and Nobody Saves the World came out around this time on the platforms. Looking at Google Trends, we can see that Vagante in blue is not as strong as the other titles at that time, so competition was fairly strong and hype for Vagante was not. However, take note that after Vagante released, interest started increasing, and that's interesting. We'd like to pick a mid-game milestone for our third marker. For Vagante, it is simply the completion of the third area called the Catacombs. This milestone is called Into the Breach. How many players are left at this point in the game? For Xbox, it's 13.4%. Steam has 18.9% left, and for PlayStation, it's 18.4%. Vagante has lost over 80% of its players by the middle of the game regardless of platform. How did Vagante do with critics? Well, Metacritic for PlayStation has it at 79 out of 100. Xbox was 75, and Steam reviews show very positive. These are solid reviews and feedback. No negativity or issues here. Our most important milestone is our fourth one. This is for completing the main story, and what we'll be ultimately basing our final score on. It definitely shows how many players finished the game and truly played Vagante. This achievement is called The Cycle Continues and is awarded for beating the game without all the rune orbs. On Xbox, 5.8% of players did just that. For PlayStation, it was 8.8%, and Steam came in the strongest with 11%. Let's pause here since we've reached the end of the game. We want to check the percentage of players that quit each platform after making it through the first milestone, but failing to reach the game completion milestone. Here you can see that Vagante is performing worse than the database average. We can also see that Steam loses the least amount of players by percentage, and Xbox loses the most. Finally, to get a feel for how the completionists treated this game, the rare milestone 5 chosen for Vagante is called Infernal Engine Hard. This is achieved if the player kills the Rust Fiend boss in hard mode. How many players achieved this rare milestone? 0.5% of players on Xbox, 0.6% on PlayStation, and 0.9% on Steam. These are the numbers, but we can make this a bit easier on the eyes. Here are the raw milestones for our platforms, and we've also added the database averages for each milestone in gray for comparison purposes. Let's get into it. At milestone 1, there's a large drop of players. PlayStation is the strongest while Steam and Xbox line up closely. As we move along with milestone 2, you see that Steam improves, and by milestone 3, Steam and PlayStation line up closely while Xbox is the lowest. When we reach the end of the game, Steam has held on to the most players, but the overall player retention for Vagante looks weak. So this is our final tally for Vagante milestones. But now let's see how Vagante stacks up against all other games in our database and find out if anyone truly played this game. We use milestone 4 as our ultimate ranking target. Here are the results for each platform for milestone 4 once again. It's time to reveal the final score Vagante has in our database. Here we go. For Xbox, we're looking at 0 out of 10. PlayStation is a low 1 out of 10, and Steam makes it to 2 out of 10. Vagante is hitting the bottom of our scoring with absolutely no one playing it on Xbox. So these are the scores, but let's see if we can tease out some other observations by looking at these results in different ways. It's time for the deep dive. Let's start with progressive player loss. Each milestone shows how many total players have stopped playing the game at that particular point. Steam loses the most at the first milestone, but after that, Xbox loses the most at every other point. You can also see starting at milestone 3 where Steam turns it around and loses the least going forward. Moving on, we can look at milestone player retention. This calculation only takes into account the player population loss as compared to the previous milestone. What you see here is that Steam starts off bad. Then Xbox loses the most through the main game, but PlayStation loses the most at the rare milestone. Each platform performed a bit differently depending on where we are in the game. Now how about completionists? How do the rarest milestones shake out on the different platforms? Here Steam clearly wins out with PlayStation and Xbox respectively taking up second and third. Finally, we check on early versus late game retention. When you read a chart like this, the best performers are further away from the center of the circle. Early game, PlayStation leads, but as we move on to end game loss, Steam really does well and separates from the pack. Let's take one final look at all the platforms and their milestone 4 results, but this time we'll show you the full percent rank within our database. This is to give you a detailed view of how the rankings played out. Use this data as you will. Let's wrap this up. So what are our major takeaways from all the data? Early player retention is not good for Vagante. Being a roguelike, this can be expected, but it still hurts. And the problems continued through the mid and end game of Vagante. 90% of players that tried the game never got to the end. If you compare this to Hades, for example, which has a comparable structure, we saw end game completion rates in the 20s. So while Vagante's numbers aren't great, and the scores are very low in our database, the type of game it is may lend itself to this type of result. As we add more of these types of games to our database, it might be interesting in the future to do a comparison between only roguelikes and see which games come out on top. Vagante is a well-liked indie game. Player reviews are really positive. It has a small but strong community supporting it, and the game provides deep and rewarding gameplay. Being a roguelike is always interesting when it comes to evaluations like ours, as sometimes the goal is to have something to play and to challenge you even if getting past milestones doesn't feel as important. But on the other hand, if players aren't progressing, then they aren't experiencing the full game, and all the devs work to deliver. In the end, hopefully this can help inform future developers who can look at these results and work to improve them going forward. The goal for game developers is to have people experience their game. We always want good work celebrated and fully experienced by the gaming community. And that's a wrap. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to do all the YouTube support stuff. I'd love to read any comments you have down below. What conclusions did you all take from this data? And of course, feel free to suggest the next game we should look at to determine if anyone played it. Until then, take care of yourself and each other.